Welcome, fellow seekers of history's shadows. Before we journey into the shadowed corridors of medieval monasteries, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Whether you're settling in for sleep in Manchester, beginning your evening wind down in Melbourne, or finding a quiet moment somewhere between, I'm grateful you've joined me here. If these explorations into history's more unsettling truths resonate with you, please subscribe so you never miss our descent into the past's darkest corners. Now, settle back and let your mind drift with me to a time when faith and fear walked hand in hand, when the promise of salvation came shadowed by the threat of damnation. Picture, if you will, the rolling hills of medieval Europe, dotted with magnificent stone abbeys whose bells called the faithful to prayer. These sacred places, with their soaring arches and illuminated manuscripts, represented the very pinnacle of spiritual devotion. Yet behind their hallowed walls, in the silence between prayers, darker currents flowed. We've all heard the romanticized tales of medieval monasteries as bastions of learning and charity, where pious monks copied ancient texts and tended to the sick. Hollywood has painted these religious orders as sanctuaries of peace, populated by kindly friars and wise abbots who embodied Christian virtue. But tonight we'll peel back that veneer of sanctity to uncover what life was truly like within these religious communities, and why the shadows they cast were often longer and darker than the light they claimed to bring. The medieval church was not merely a spiritual institution, but the most powerful political and economic force in Europe. It controlled vast estates, commanded armies, and held the power of life and death over millions of souls. Within this empire of faith, the religious orders operated as elite units, bound by sacred vows, yet often corrupted by the very human desires they sought to transcend. Tonight, we'll walk the cloistered halls where ambition masqueraded as devotion, where the promise of eternal reward justified temporal cruelty, and where the pursuit of purity led to practices that would shock even the most hardened cynic. We'll meet abbots who ruled like tyrants, monks who abandoned all pretense of charity, and entire orders that became engines of oppression rather than salvation. But first, let us understand the world that gave birth to these corrupted sanctuaries. Medieval Europe was a land where death stalked every doorway, where famine and plague could wipe out entire villages in a season, and where the promise of heaven offered the only escape from an existence that was often brutally short and filled with suffering. Into this desperate world stepped the church, offering not just spiritual comfort, but tangible power over the forces that terrified the common folk. The religious orders emerged from this crucible of fear and faith. Some, like the Benedictines, traced their roots back to the earliest days of Christianity, when hermits fled to the desert to escape worldly corruption. Others, like the Franciscans and Dominicans, arose in response to the social upheavals of the High Middle Ages, promising reform and renewal. But as these orders grew in wealth and influence, many lost sight of their founding ideals, becoming instead instruments of control and exploitation. Consider the Cistercians, who began as reformers seeking to return to the pure rule of Saint Benedict. They established themselves in remote wilderness areas, clearing forests and draining swamps through backbreaking labor. Yet within generations, these same monasteries had become vast agricultural enterprises worked by an army of lay brothers who lived in conditions barely distinguishable from slavery. The white-robed monks who had once embraced poverty now dined on delicacies while their workers subsisted on gruel. Or examine the Knights Templar, warrior monks who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience while amassing vast fortunes through banking and trade. These holy warriors, who claimed to fight for Christ's glory in the Holy Land, became so wealthy and powerful that they posed a threat to kings and popes alike. Their eventual destruction would reveal a web of secret rituals, financial corruption, and political intrigue that reached to the very heart of medieval society. The monastic life itself, supposedly devoted to spiritual contemplation and service to God, often became a theatre for the darkest human impulses. Young nobles were forced into religious life against their will, their inheritance seized by families eager to consolidate wealth. These unwilling monks and nuns brought their resentments and ambitions into the cloister, turning what should have been havens of peace into hotbeds of intrigue and violence. Within the monastery walls, a rigid hierarchy emerged that mirrored and often exceeded the cruelties of secular society. Novices were subjected to brutal hazing rituals disguised as spiritual discipline. Those who questioned authority faced punishments that ranged from public humiliation to solitary confinement in underground cells. The very vows that were supposed to liberate the soul from worldly concerns became chains that bound individuals to institutions that exploited their labor and crushed their spirits. The educational mission of the monasteries, so celebrated by modern historians, had its own dark underbelly. Knowledge was hoarded and controlled, with access limited to those who demonstrated absolute obedience to church doctrine. Books that challenged religious orthodoxy were burned, their authors persecuted as heretics. The great libraries of the monasteries, rather than being centres of free inquiry, became instruments of intellectual oppression, preserving only those ideas that reinforced the church's temporal power. Even the charitable works for which the monasteries were renowned often served more to enhance their reputation than to genuinely help the suffering. The sick who sought treatment at monastic hospitals found themselves subjected to primitive medical practices based more on superstition than knowledge. The poor who came begging for alms were given just enough to keep them dependent while being subjected to lectures about their moral failings. Orphans placed in monastic care often found themselves condemned to lives of unpaid servitude, their labour enriching the very institutions that claimed to protect them. The corruption extended to the very heart of monastic spirituality. The elaborate rituals and ceremonies that marked religious life became empty performances, divorced from any genuine spiritual meaning. Monks went through the motions of prayer while their minds dwelt on worldly concerns. The sacred texts they copied were often altered to serve political purposes, with inconvenient passages omitted or rewritten to support the church's agenda. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the way the religious orders perverted the very concept of divine justice. They claimed to speak for God while using their supposed spiritual authority to justify the most appalling cruelties. Heretics were burned alive not out of hatred, the church claimed, but out of love for their souls. The Inquisition, run largely by Dominican friars, tortured confessions from its victims while maintaining that it was saving them from eternal damnation. The wealth accumulated by the monasteries became a source of scandal even to medieval observers. While preaching the virtues of poverty, abbots lived in luxury that rivaled that of kings. Monastic treasuries overflowed with gold and jewels donated by the faithful, yet the surrounding countryside often languished in poverty and neglect. The contrast between the church's teachings and its practices became so stark that it sparked reform movements and ultimately contributed to the Protestant Reformation. As we delve deeper into these dark histories, we'll uncover stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about medieval religious life. We'll meet individuals who struggled against the corruption around them, often paying a terrible price for their integrity. We'll explore the psychological mechanisms that allowed good people to participate in evil systems, and we'll see how the pursuit of absolute power corrupted even those who began with the noblest intentions. The religious orders of medieval Europe were not simply collections of holy men and women dedicated to serving God. They were complex institutions shaped by the same human drives that motivated secular society: greed, ambition, fear, and the desire for control. Understanding their true nature requires us to look beyond the pious facade and examine the human reality beneath. Tonight's journey will take us through monastery gates that opened not onto paradise but onto a world where spiritual authority masked temporal tyranny, where the promise of salvation came at the cost of human dignity, and where the very institutions meant to embody divine love became engines of oppression and exploitation. The darkness we'll explore is not merely historical curiosity, but a reminder of how easily noble ideals can be corrupted when power goes unchecked and authority claims divine sanction. As we prepare to enter this shadowed world, remember that the men and women we'll encounter were products of their time, shaped by beliefs and circumstances we can barely imagine. Yet their stories remain relevant because they reveal truths about human nature that transcend any particular historical period. The capacity for both great good and terrible evil exists in every age, and the religious orders of medieval Europe serve as powerful examples of how thin the line between the two can be. So let us begin our exploration of these dark sanctuaries, these places where the sacred and the profane intertwined in ways that would shock the faithful who place their trust in religious authority. Part 2. The corruption of sacred vows. Behind the towering stone walls of medieval abbeys and monasteries, a darker reality festered beneath the veneer of pious devotion. While these religious houses were meant to be sanctuaries of spiritual purity, they had become breeding grounds for corruption, exploitation, and moral decay that would make even the most hardened secular lord blush. The very foundations of monastic life were built upon 3 sacred vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Yet in practice, these vows had become nothing more than hollow words, twisted and perverted by those who sought power rather than salvation. The irony was palpable. Men and women who claimed to have renounced the world had, in fact, embraced its worst impulses with a fervour that would shame the most ambitious merchant or ruthless knight. Consider the supposed vow of poverty. While peasants starved in the fields beyond monastery walls, abbots lived in opulent splendour that rivaled royal courts. They dined on roasted peacock and imported wines, while their flocks subsisted on bread and water. The monasteries of Cluny and Saint-Denis accumulated vast treasuries of gold, silver, and precious stones, all while preaching the virtue of material detachment to the masses who funded their lavish lifestyles through crushing tithes and donations. The hypocrisy ran so deep that some abbots maintained private armies, not for protection, but for conquest. They waged wars against neighbouring monasteries over land disputes, turning houses of God into fortresses of greed. The Abbey of Saint-Riquier in France became infamous for its abbots' military campaigns, conducted under the banner of Christ, but motivated purely by territorial expansion and wealth accumulation. The vow of chastity proved equally malleable in the hands of corrupt clergy. Behind closed doors, many monasteries operated more like brothels than houses of worship. Monks and nuns engaged in flagrant sexual misconduct, with some abbesses running what amounted to sophisticated prostitution rings. The convent of Sant'Agata in Italy became notorious throughout the region for its nocturnal visitors, wealthy patrons who paid handsomely for the company of supposedly celibate nuns. Even more disturbing were the systematic abuses of power that occurred within these walls. Young novices, often sent to monasteries against their will by families seeking to reduce the number of mouths to feed, became victims of predatory behaviour by their supposed spiritual guides. The isolation of monastic life created perfect conditions for such exploitation, with victims having no recourse and nowhere to turn for help. The third vow, obedience, became a tool of oppression rather than spiritual discipline. Abbots wielded absolute authority over their subjects, demanding not just compliance but complete submission of will and thought. This power was frequently abused to silence dissent, punish rivals, and maintain the corrupt status quo. Those who dared to speak out against misconduct found themselves subjected to brutal punishments, solitary confinement, or even mysterious disappearances. Perhaps most shocking was how these religious orders manipulated the very concept of salvation for financial gain. They sold indulgences with the shameless efficiency of market traders, promising reduced time in purgatory for the right price. The wealthy could literally buy their way into heaven, while the poor were left to suffer the full consequences of their sins. This commodification of divine grace represented perhaps the ultimate perversion of Christian teaching. The intellectual corruption was equally damaging to society as a whole. Monasteries, which should have been centers of learning and enlightenment, instead became fortresses of ignorance and superstition. Monks deliberately destroyed or hid ancient texts that contradicted church doctrine, burning libraries and persecuting scholars who dared to question established dogma. The loss of classical knowledge during this period cannot be overstated. Countless works of philosophy, science, and literature vanished forever into the flames of religious fanaticism. This deliberate suppression of knowledge served a dual purpose. It kept the population ignorant and dependent, while preserving the church's monopoly on information. Literacy was actively discouraged among the common people, ensuring they remained reliant on corrupt clergy for interpretation of scripture and divine will. The result was a society trapped in intellectual darkness, unable to progress or question the systems that oppressed them. The economic impact of this corruption extended far beyond monastery walls. Religious orders had become some of the largest landowners in medieval Europe, controlling vast estates worked by essentially enslaved peasants. These lands were often exempt from taxation, creating an unfair advantage over secular lords while depriving kingdoms of crucial revenue. The wealth accumulated by monasteries was effectively removed from circulation, hoarded in treasuries that served no productive purpose for society. Meanwhile, the genuine spiritual needs of the population went unmet. Instead of providing comfort to the suffering and guidance to the lost, corrupt clergy focused on enriching themselves and expanding their temporal power. The sick and dying were abandoned unless they could pay for prayers and last rites. Orphans and widows, who should have been protected by Christian charity, were often exploited as cheap labor or worse. The psychological damage inflicted by this corruption cannot be measured, but was undoubtedly profound. People who had placed their faith and trust in religious institutions found themselves betrayed and exploited by the very people who claimed to represent God on earth. This breach of trust created a deep cynicism that would eventually contribute to the collapse of medieval society's spiritual foundations. Some attempted reform, but these efforts were typically crushed by the entrenched interests that benefited from the corrupt system. Bernard of Clairvaux and other reformers tried to return monastic life to its original principles, but their movements were either co-opted or destroyed by those who profited from the status quo. The few genuinely pious individuals who remained in religious orders found themselves isolated and powerless against the overwhelming tide of corruption. The recruitment practices of these orders revealed another layer of moral bankruptcy. Rather than seeking individuals with genuine spiritual calling, monasteries often functioned as dumping grounds for society's unwanted members. Families sent their disabled children, unmarriageable daughters, and troublesome sons to religious houses, paying substantial fees for the privilege. These involuntary recruits, having no desire for monastic life, often became the most corrupt members of their communities. The judicial system within monasteries operated as a parallel legal structure, exempt from secular oversight and accountability. Abbots could imprison, torture, or even execute those under their authority with complete impunity. This created pockets of lawlessness, where the worst human impulses could flourish unchecked. Stories emerged of secret dungeons, mysterious deaths, and systematic torture that would make hardened criminals recoil in horror. Perhaps most damaging of all was how this corruption poisoned the very concept of religious devotion for future generations. When the supposed representatives of God on earth lived lives of such obvious hypocrisy and moral bankruptcy, it became impossible for thinking people to maintain faith in religious institutions. The seeds of the Protestant Reformation and eventual secularization of European society can be traced directly to the moral failures of medieval religious orders. The international nature of these religious orders also facilitated corruption on a massive scale. Wealth and influence could be transferred across national boundaries, creating a shadow network of power that operated beyond the control of any secular authority. This international reach allowed corrupt practices to spread like a plague, infecting religious houses across the continent with standardized methods of exploitation and abuse. As we reflect on this dark chapter in human history, we must remember that the corruption of medieval religious orders represents more than just historical curiosity. It serves as a stark reminder of what happens when institutions claiming moral authority operate without accountability or transparency. The suffering inflicted by these supposedly holy men and women upon the vulnerable and defenseless stands as testimony to humanity's capacity for evil, even when cloaked in the garments of righteousness. The peasants and common folk who bore the brunt of this exploitation had no recourse, no voice, and no hope of justice. They were trapped in a system that promised salvation while delivering only suffering, that preached love while practicing cruelty, that claimed to serve God while serving only mammon. The dark underbelly of medieval monasteries. While the previous installments exposed the corruption plaguing medieval religious orders, we've only scratched the surface of the systematic abuse that festered within monastery walls. The very institutions that preached salvation became breeding grounds for exploitation that would make even the most cynical observer recoil in horror. Consider the practice of oblation, where wealthy families essentially dumped unwanted children into monasteries as early as age 7. These children, called oblates, had no choice in their fate, and were often treated as little more than indentured servants by the adult monks. Many were subjected to brutal physical and sexual abuse, their cries for help muffled by stone walls and the conspiracy of silence that protected their tormentors. The monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland became notorious for its treatment of these child oblates. Records reveal that young boys were routinely beaten with leather straps for minor infractions, forced to sleep in freezing cells, and denied adequate food as punishment. Some were made to carry heavy stones for hours as penance, their small bodies breaking under the weight of monastic discipline. But the abuse wasn't limited to physical violence. Sexual predation ran rampant throughout the medieval monastic system, protected by the very hierarchy that claimed moral authority. Abbots and senior monks used their positions to exploit vulnerable novices and oblates, knowing that their victims had nowhere to turn for justice. The Church's own records, when they bothered to document such incidents at all, reveal a pattern of systematic cover-ups that would span centuries. The monastery of Cluny, despite its reputation as a centre of reform, harboured some of the most egregious offenders. Abbot Hugh of Cluny, canonised as a saint by the Catholic Church, presided over an institution where young monks were routinely sexually abused by their superiors. When complaints were raised, victims were transferred to remote locations or simply disappeared entirely, their fate sealed by the very men who claimed to represent God's will on earth. The psychological torture inflicted within these walls was perhaps even more insidious than the physical abuse. Monks developed elaborate systems of mental manipulation designed to break the will of those under their control. They used sleep deprivation, isolation, and constant surveillance to create an atmosphere of terror that kept victims compliant, and silent. At the monastery of Fleury, monks were forbidden from speaking to one another, except during designated hours, creating an environment of paranoia where any gesture or glance could be interpreted as defiance. Those suspected of harboring rebellious thoughts were subjected to extended periods of solitary confinement in underground cells, emerging weeks later as broken shells of their former selves. The economic exploitation within monasteries was equally systematic and cruel. While abbots lived in luxury, enjoying fine wines and elaborate feasts, the common monks and lay brothers were forced to work like slaves, their labor generating vast wealth that never trickled down to those who created it. The monastery of Citeaux, headquarters of the Cistercian order, accumulated enormous riches through the unpaid labor of thousands of monks and lay workers who were promised spiritual rewards in exchange for their earthly suffering. These workers were often malnourished and overworked to the point of collapse, their health sacrificed on the altar of monastic profit. Many died young from exhaustion and disease, their bodies buried in unmarked graves while their labor continued to enrich their religious overlords. The corruption extended to the very foundations of monastic scholarship, which we've been told preserved knowledge for future generations. In reality, monks routinely destroyed texts that challenged church doctrine, burning entire libraries to eliminate inconvenient truths. The monastery of Monte Cassino, supposedly a beacon of learning, systematically eliminated works of classical philosophy and science that contradicted Christian teaching. Monks rewrote historical accounts to glorify church leaders and vilify their enemies, creating a false narrative that painted the church as humanity's savior while hiding its role as oppressor. They forged documents to support land claims, fabricated miracles to increase donations, and altered religious texts to justify their own power and privilege. The medical practices within monasteries were often little more than sadistic experiments conducted on helpless patients. Monks claiming to be healers subjected the sick and dying to horrific treatments, using their suffering as opportunities to test bizarre theories about disease and the human body. The monastery infirmaries became chambers of torture where patients were bled to death, poisoned with toxic concoctions, and subjected to surgical procedures without any understanding of anatomy or hygiene. At the monastery of St. Bartholomew in London, monks regularly performed crude surgeries on conscious patients, believing that pain was a necessary component of healing. They amputated limbs with rusty tools, cauterized wounds with red-hot irons, and administered mercury and other poisons as medicine, all while claiming divine inspiration for their methods. The treatment of women in and around monasteries revealed another layer of systematic abuse. Nuns were routinely subjected to sexual exploitation by male clergy who visited their convents under the pretense of spiritual guidance. Many were forced into prostitution to generate income for corrupt abbesses, while others were imprisoned in convents against their will by families seeking to avoid paying dowries. The convent of San Pier Damiani in Italy became notorious for its treatment of young women who were essentially sold into religious slavery by their families. These women were forced to sign over their inheritances to the convent, then subjected to years of physical and emotional abuse designed to break their spirits and ensure their compliance. Female religious institutions also served as dumping grounds for women who had been raped or otherwise disgraced in the eyes of society. These victims were forced to live as penitents, subjected to constant humiliation and punishment for crimes committed against them. They were made to wear rough hair shirts, sleep on stone floors, and subsist on bread and water, while their attackers faced no consequences whatsoever. The monastery's role in perpetuating social inequality was equally devastating. While claiming to serve the poor, religious orders actually worked to maintain the very systems that created poverty in the first place. They collaborated with noble families to suppress peasant uprisings, provided religious justification for serfdom, and used their influence to prevent any meaningful social reform. The monastery of Vézelay in France became a fortress of oppression, its monks working hand in hand with local lords to crush any hint of peasant rebellion. When villagers dared to demand fair treatment, the monks declared them heretics and called for military intervention to restore order. The result was a massacre that left hundreds of peasants dead and their families destitute. Perhaps most damaging of all was the way these religious orders corrupted the very concept of spirituality itself. They turned faith into a commodity to be bought and sold, transforming sacred rituals into profit-generating enterprises that enriched the church while impoverishing the faithful. The sale of indulgences, the charging of fees for basic religious services, and the manipulation of believers' fears about the afterlife created a system of spiritual extortion that would persist for centuries. The monastery of Cluny pioneered many of these exploitative practices, developing elaborate schemes to extract money from believers at every stage of life. They charged fees for baptisms, confirmations, marriages, and funerals, ensuring that even the most basic human experiences were monetized for the church's benefit. Those who couldn't pay were denied services or forced into debt that would burden their families for generations. The psychological manipulation employed by these orders was sophisticated and ruthless. They exploited people's natural fear of death and uncertainty about the afterlife, creating elaborate mythologies about purgatory and hell that could only be overcome through generous donations to the church. They preyed on grieving families, convincing them that the souls of their departed loved ones would suffer eternal torment unless substantial payments were made to ensure their salvation. These practices created a culture of fear and superstition that stifled intellectual growth and social progress for centuries. People lived in constant terror of divine punishment, afraid to question church authority or seek knowledge outside the narrow confines of approved doctrine. The result was a society trapped in ignorance and servitude, unable to break free from the chains forged by their supposed spiritual guides. The legacy of this systematic corruption continues to echo through history, reminding us that institutions claiming moral authority are often the most dangerous when left unchecked. The medieval monasteries, far from being bastions of virtue and learning, were in many cases elaborate criminal enterprises that used religious authority to mask their exploitation of the vulnerable and defenseless. As we examine these dark chapters of history, we must remember that the true victims were not just the monks and nuns trapped within these corrupt systems, but the countless ordinary people who suffered under their oppression. Their stories, long suppressed by those who benefited from their silence, deserve to be told and remembered as a warning about the dangers of unchecked religious authority and the human capacity for evil disguised as virtue. The evidence is clear and overwhelming. Medieval religious orders, despite their claims of serving God and humanity, were in reality engines of exploitation and abuse that caused immeasurable suffering while enriching themselves at the expense of those they claimed to serve. The Weight of Shadows, exposing medieval monasteries' hidden corruption. As the morning bells of Cluny Abbey echoed across the Burgundian countryside in the year 1275, Brother Thomas pulled his woolen cowl tighter against the bitter cold and descended into the depths of the monastery's wine cellars. What he discovered there would haunt him for the rest of his days. Barrels upon barrels of the finest vintages, silks from Constantinople hidden beneath rough sacking, and chests overflowing with gold coins bearing the seals of kings and merchants. This was not the poverty that Christ had commanded, nor the humility that Saint Benedict had prescribed. This was the dark reality that festered beneath the sacred vows of medieval religious orders. The monasteries and convents that dotted the European landscape were supposed to be beacons of spiritual purity, centers of learning and charity where monks and nuns devoted their lives to prayer, study, and service to God. Yet behind their towering stone walls and beneath their soaring Gothic arches lay a web of corruption so vast and so deeply entrenched that it would take centuries to fully unravel. The very institutions that preached poverty lived in luxury. Those who vowed chastity kept concubines and mistresses. Those who promised obedience ruled like petty tyrants over vast estates worked by serfs and slaves. The corruption began at the very top. Abbots and abbesses, supposedly chosen for their spiritual wisdom and devotion, were more often than not appointed based on their noble birth or their ability to bring wealth and political connections to their houses. These ecclesiastical lords lived in palatial quarters, dined on exotic delicacies, and maintained retinues of servants that rivaled those of secular nobles. The Abbey of Saint-Denis, near Paris, was notorious for its abbots, who lived more like princes than monks, hosting lavish banquets where the wine flowed freely and the entertainment was decidedly worldly. Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, who rebuilt his abbey church in the revolutionary Gothic style, justified his love of luxury by claiming that beautiful objects elevated the soul to God. Yet critics whispered that his true motivation was vanity and the desire to rival the splendor of kings. His successor, Abbot Odo of Duil, was even more brazen in his excesses, maintaining a private menagerie of exotic animals and commissioning illuminated manuscripts more for their artistic beauty than their spiritual content. The wealth that funded these excesses came from multiple sources, all of them morally questionable. Monasteries controlled vast estates worked by peasants who owed them labor service and a portion of their crops. These religious landlords were often harsher masters than their secular counterparts, demanding ever higher rents and services while offering little in return. The monks of Bury St. Edmunds were particularly notorious for their oppression of the local peasantry, extracting heavy taxes and fines while living in comfort behind their abbey walls. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was rampant throughout the monastic system. Wealthy families would purchase positions for their younger sons, turning abbeys into hereditary domains, where spiritual qualifications mattered far less than the size of one's purse. The Abbey of Farfa in Italy was controlled for generations by the same noble family, with each abbot passing the position to his nephew or cousin, treating the monastery's vast holdings as their personal inheritance. The sale of indulgences provided another lucrative revenue stream. These supposed remissions of punishment for sins were hawked like common merchandise, with monks and friars travelling from town to town, promising salvation to anyone willing to pay the price. Such crass commercialization of divine grace scandalized even medieval sensibilities, yet the practice continued because it was simply too profitable to abandon. Perhaps most shocking of all was the systematic violation of the vow of chastity. While celibacy was supposed to free religious men and women from worldly attachments, allowing them to focus entirely on their spiritual duties, the reality was far different. These relationships were so common that some bishops actually taxed priests for maintaining them, treating sexual transgression as a revenue source rather than a sin to be eliminated. The great monastery of Cluny, which at its height controlled over 1,000 religious houses across Europe, was plagued by sexual scandals. Monks were discovered living with women in quarters that were supposed to be strictly segregated. Some even fathered children, passing their illegitimate offspring off as nephews or wards. The Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland was forced to expel dozens of monks for sexual misconduct, while the Benedictine house at Monte Cassino, the very birthplace of Western monasticism, saw its reputation tarnished by repeated scandals involving the sexual exploitation of novices and pilgrims. Female religious communities faced even greater challenges in maintaining their vows. Convents were often used as dumping grounds for unmarriageable daughters of noble families, filled with women who had no genuine religious vocation. These reluctant nuns chafed under the restrictions of monastic life, leading to frequent violations of their vows. The convent of Sant'Angelo in Milan became notorious as a brothel in religious disguise, where wealthy men could purchase the favors of aristocratic nuns. When church investigators finally intervened, they discovered a complex system of bribery and coercion that had turned the sacred space into a den of vice. The educational mission of monasteries, once their greatest glory, also became corrupted by worldly concerns. While monks had preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages, copying ancient manuscripts and maintaining libraries when secular culture collapsed. By the High Middle Ages, many religious houses had abandoned serious scholarship in favor of more profitable pursuits. The scriptorium at many monasteries fell into disuse, as monks found it more lucrative to rent out their lands or engage in trade than to spend long hours copying texts. Even worse, some monasteries actively suppressed learning that threatened their authority or wealth. When Roger Bacon, the Franciscan friar and pioneering scientist, developed new methods of inquiry that challenged traditional authority, his own order imprisoned him for years. The monastery of San Lorenzo in Florence was accused of deliberately destroying ancient Greek texts that contradicted Christian doctrine, while the Abbey of Reichenau was said to have sold priceless manuscripts to merchants who used the parchment for wrapping goods. The corruption extended to the very practice of worship itself. The elaborate liturgical ceremonies that filled monastic days became empty theatrical performances, recited by rote with no spiritual feeling. Monks would race through their prayers to finish quickly, mumbling Latin words they barely understood. Some hired substitutes to perform their religious duties while they attended to more worldly concerns. The divine office, which was supposed to sanctify every hour of the day, became a burden to be endured rather than a joy to be embraced. Even charity, the cornerstone of Christian virtue, was perverted by monastic greed. While monasteries maintained hospitals and fed the poor, these works of mercy were often used as covers for less noble activities. The Hospital of the Holy Spirit in Rome was discovered to be selling the bodies of deceased patients to anatomists, while the almshouse attached to Westminster Abbey was found to be diverting food meant for the poor to the monks' own tables. The very architecture of medieval monasteries reveals the depth of their corruption. While the rules of monastic orders called for simplicity and poverty, the great abbey churches that still dominate the European landscape were monuments to pride and ostentation. The rebuilding of Canterbury Cathedral after the murder of Thomas Becket cost a fortune that could have fed thousands of poor families for years. The monks justified such expenditures as offerings to God, but critics saw them as monuments to human vanity. The economic power of these corrupt religious houses had profound effects on medieval society. By controlling vast amounts of land and wealth, monasteries became major players in the feudal system, often more concerned with protecting their temporal interests than pursuing spiritual goals. They maintained private armies, engaged in territorial disputes with neighboring lords, and even went to war against each other. The Abbey of Cluny and the Abbey of Citeaux, both supposedly dedicated to the same Christian god, fought bitter battles over control of daughter houses and their revenues. This militarization of monasticism reached its peak with the military orders, like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. Initially founded to protect pilgrims and care for the sick during the Crusades, these orders quickly became international banking houses and military powers in their own right. The Templars' vast wealth and secretive practices made them objects of suspicion and envy, ultimately leading to their destruction by King Philip IV of France, who coveted their riches and feared their power. The corruption of medieval religious orders was not merely a matter of individual moral failings, but a systemic problem rooted in the very structure of medieval society. When monasteries became major landholders and political powers, they inevitably became corrupted by the very worldliness they were supposed to reject. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience became empty formalities, observed in the breach rather than the practice. Yet even as these dark truths about medieval monasticism come to light, we must remember that not all religious houses fell into such depths of corruption. There were always reformers who tried to return their communities to their original ideals, and there were individual monks and nuns who lived lives of genuine sanctity despite the corruption around them. The Cistercian reform movement of the 12th century attempted to restore monastic simplicity, while figures like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux preached against the excesses of their age. But these reform movements were swimming against a powerful tide. The very success of monasticism as an institution made it vulnerable to the temptations of wealth and power. As night fell over the medieval landscape and the bells of corrupt abbeys called the faithful to prayer, one could only wonder how many of those who answered the call were truly seeking God, and how many were merely going through the motions of a system that had lost its way. The shadows that fell across medieval monasteries were long and dark, stretching from the wine cellars of Cluny to the counting houses of the Templars, from the brothels disguised as convents to the scriptoriums where ancient wisdom was sold for silver. These were institutions that had forgotten their purpose, communities that had lost their way, and souls that had traded eternal rewards for temporal pleasures. In their rise and fall, we see reflected the eternal human struggle between the sacred and the profane, between the call to transcendence and the pull of worldly corruption. The weight of these shadows still lingers today, reminding us that even the most sacred institutions are vulnerable to the corrupting influence of power and wealth. As we close our eyes and drift towards sleep, we might reflect on Brother Thomas, still wandering those dark cellars, bearing witness to the gap between religious ideals and human reality, carrying the burden of knowledge that would forever change his understanding of the holy orders he had once revered. As night deepens across the land and the last embers die in peasant hearths, let us turn our gaze toward the very institution that promised salvation, yet often delivered something far more sinister. The monasteries and convents that dotted the medieval landscape were meant to be beacons of divine light, sanctuaries where the faithful could commune with God through prayer, contemplation, and humble service. Yet within those hallowed walls, behind the chanted psalms and illuminated manuscripts, another story unfolded. A story of corruption so pervasive, of appetites so unchecked, that the very foundations of Christian virtue crumbled beneath the weight of human frailty. For while the peasants we have just witnessed toiled in mud and misery, bound to their lords by chains of servitude, the religious orders that claimed to have renounced worldly pleasures had forged chains of their own, chains of gold and silver, of land and political influence, of secrets that would make even the most hardened sinner recoil in horror. These were not the simple failings of weak flesh that might be forgiven with a few Hail Marys and an act of contrition. These were systematic betrayals of everything the monastic life claimed to represent. In the abbeys and priories scattered across Christendom, where monks and nuns had supposedly taken sacred vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, a different trinity held sway. Greed, lust, and the ruthless pursuit of temporal power had replaced the gentle teachings of Christ. The very men and women who preached humility to the masses lived in splendor that would make kings envious. They who counseled celibacy indulged in carnal pleasures that scandalized even the most worldly nobles. They who spoke of charity hoarded wealth while the poor starved at their gates. But perhaps most chilling of all was how they wielded their spiritual authority as a weapon. The power to grant or deny salvation, to declare someone blessed or damned, to intercede with the Almighty on behalf of desperate souls. This sacred trust, this most profound responsibility, became nothing more than a tool for manipulation, extortion, and control. The church that claimed to be the bride of Christ had become something far more sinister, a predator that fed on the faith and desperation of the innocent. Within the scriptorium, where patient scribes were meant to copy sacred texts for the edification of future generations, we find instead the careful documentation of financial transactions, the recording of bribes, and the destruction of inconvenient truths. The libraries that should have preserved the wisdom of ages became repositories of forbidden knowledge, not the mystical secrets of divine communion, but the mundane records of earthly corruption, account books detailing the sale of salvation, ledgers recording the price of absolution, correspondence arranging the exchange of spiritual favors for temporal rewards. The monasteries had evolved into something their founders never intended. They were no longer communities of faith seeking closeness to God through withdrawal from worldly concerns. Instead, they had become corporate entities, vast business enterprises that happened to dress their profit margins in the language of prayer. The rule of St. Benedict, with its emphasis on simplicity and communal living, had been perverted into a charter for exploitation and excess. Consider the great Abbey of Cluny in France, once the jewel of the Benedictine order. By the height of the Middle Ages, it controlled hundreds of subsidiary monasteries across Europe, commanding resources that rivaled those of kings. The abbot of Cluny lived in apartments that would shame a palace, dining on delicacies imported from across the known world, while his monks grew fat on the labor of peasants who believed their tithes were buying them a place in heaven. The abbey's churches glittered with gold and precious stones, paid for by the desperate offerings of families hoping to purchase the salvation of deceased loved ones. But material excess was only the beginning. Within the cloisters, where silence and contemplation should have reigned supreme, a different kind of communion was taking place. The vow of celibacy, that sacred promise to remain pure in body and spirit, had become little more than a formality to be circumvented with creative interpretation. Monks kept mistresses in nearby villages, fathering children who would never know their fathers' true identities. Nuns engaged in liaisons that would have scandalized even the most debauched courtiers, their habits concealing pregnancies that ended in whispered arrangements with midwives sworn to secrecy. The corruption extended far beyond mere sexual impropriety, though that was shocking enough. These religious communities had become centers of political intrigue, where abbots and abbesses schemed with kings and nobles, trading spiritual influence for temporal power. They manipulated papal elections, arranged strategic marriages, and even fomented wars when it served their interests. The men and women who had supposedly renounced the world had instead become puppet masters, pulling strings from behind the curtain of religious authority. Most disturbing of all was how they preyed upon the most vulnerable members of society. Young children, offered to monasteries by desperate parents who could not afford to feed them, found themselves trapped in institutions that cared nothing for their spiritual welfare. These oblates, as they were called, were subjected to forms of abuse that defied every principle of Christian charity. Physical violence was commonplace, justified as necessary discipline for the salvation of young souls. But there were darker crimes as well, acts of such depravity that they were carefully hidden behind walls of silence and complicity. The monastic communities had developed their own internal economies of exploitation, where novices and younger members served not as spiritual apprentices, but as unpaid laborers for their superiors' comfort. The abbots and priors, who should have been examples of humble service, instead ruled like feudal lords, demanding absolute obedience from their subordinates while they themselves answered to no earthly authority. They claimed to speak for God, and who would dare contradict the voice of the Almighty? This corruption was not confined to a few rogue institutions or a handful of corrupt individuals. It was systemic, woven into the very fabric of medieval religious life. The church hierarchy, from local priests to cardinals in Rome, was complicit in maintaining this system of spiritual exploitation. They turned blind eyes to obvious abuses, accepted bribes to ignore complaints, and actively participated in the buying and selling of religious offices. The practice of simony, the purchase of sacred positions, had become so commonplace that it was barely remarked upon. The sale of indulgences represented perhaps the most brazen example of this commodification of salvation. These documents, supposedly granting remission of sins or reducing time in purgatory, were sold like any other merchandise. Travelling salesmen, armed with the authority of Rome, would arrive in villages and towns with cartloads of spiritual pardons for sale. They promised that for the right price, any sin could be forgiven, any deceased relative could be freed from the torments of the afterlife. The desperate and the gullible emptied their purses, believing they were purchasing something more valuable than gold, the favour of God himself. But the religious orders went further still in their exploitation of human faith and fear. They manufactured relics, claiming that ordinary bones belonged to saints, that fragments of wood came from the true cross, that scraps of cloth had touched the garments of the Virgin Mary. These fraudulent artifacts were then used to attract pilgrims, who would travel hundreds of miles and spend their life savings for the privilege of venerating what they believed were holy objects. The monasteries that housed these fake relics grew wealthy from the offerings of the faithful, building ever more elaborate shrines to display their counterfeit treasures. The educational mission of the monasteries, once a genuine attempt to preserve and transmit knowledge, had been corrupted as well. Instead of teaching freely and openly, they hoarded information, using their monopoly on literacy and learning to maintain their power over an ignorant populace. They carefully controlled what texts were copied and preserved, ensuring that only those works that supported their authority survived. Dissenting voices were silenced, their writings destroyed, their ideas buried beneath centuries of institutional orthodoxy. Even the practice of charity, that most fundamental Christian duty, had been perverted into a tool of control and manipulation. The monasteries would indeed feed the poor and care for the sick, but always with strings attached. Recipients of monastic charity were expected to show proper deference, to accept whatever treatment they received without complaint, and to spread word of the religious community's generosity. Those who questioned or criticized found themselves cut off from aid, left to starve, or die as examples to others. The very architecture of these religious institutions reflected their corruption. Instead of the simple, humble structures that would befit communities dedicated to poverty and self-denial, the great monasteries and cathedrals rose like monuments to earthly ambition. Their towers reached toward heaven not in humble supplication, but in arrogant assertion of power. Their walls enclosed not communities of prayer, but centers of worldly influence. Their treasuries overflowed not with spiritual riches, but with gold and silver extorted from the faithful. Within the chapter houses where monastic communities were supposed to gather for spiritual discussion and mutual correction, we find instead tribunals where dissent was crushed and conformity enforced through fear and intimidation. Brothers and sisters who dared to question the growing corruption of their communities found themselves accused of heresy, subjected to trials that were mockeries of justice. The very people who should have been their spiritual family became their persecutors, using the tools of religious authority to silence anyone who threatened their comfortable arrangements. The guest houses that were meant to offer hospitality to travelers and pilgrims became centers of espionage and political intrigue. Visitors were carefully observed, their conversations monitored, their loyalties assessed. Information gathered from these supposedly neutral sanctuaries was then sold to the highest bidder, whether king or rebel, pope or anti-pope. The ancient tradition of sanctuary, the promise that religious buildings would offer protection to those in need, was compromised by communities that owed their first loyalty not to God, but to their own temporal interests. Perhaps most tragically, the spiritual life that was supposed to be the heart of monastic existence had withered away entirely in many communities. the hours of prayer became mere formalities, chanted without thought or feeling by men and women whose minds were occupied with worldly concerns. The meditation and contemplation that should have brought them closer to the divine became opportunities to plan their next business venture or political maneuver. The very purpose for which these communities had been founded, the pursuit of holiness and union with God, had been abandoned in favor of pursuits that any secular merchant or nobleman might have envied. The corruption extended even to the most sacred aspects of religious life. The Mass, that central mystery of Christian faith, became a commodity to be bought and sold. Wealthy patrons would pay for hundreds or thousands of masses to be said for their souls or the souls of their relatives, and the monasteries would comply by staging perfunctory ceremonies that satisfied the letter of the contract, while completely ignoring its spiritual intent. Priests would rush through multiple masses in a single day, gabbling the sacred words without meaning or reverence, transforming the most solemn rituals of their faith into assembly line productions designed to maximize profit. The confessional, that sacred space where sinners were supposed to find forgiveness and spiritual guidance, became instead a source of intelligence and blackmail material. Monks and priests who heard the confessions of powerful individuals would carefully remember what they learned, using this information to advance their own interests or those of their institutions. The seal of confession, one of the most sacred obligations of the clergy, was routinely violated when it served their purposes. Penitents who had bared their souls in hope of divine mercy found their secrets used against them by the very people who had promised them absolution. The monastic libraries, those repositories of knowledge and wisdom that should have been treasures for all humanity, were deliberately kept from those who could have benefited most from their contents. Rare medical texts that could have saved lives were locked away while people died of treatable diseases. Historical chronicles that could have provided important lessons for rulers were hidden while kingdoms fell to preventable mistakes. Scientific treatises that could have advanced human understanding were suppressed while ignorance and superstition flourished. The monasteries had become not guardians of knowledge, but its jailers, hoarding information like any other valuable commodity. Even death, that final equalizer that should have reminded these religious communities of their mortality and the vanity of earthly pursuits, became another opportunity for exploitation. The wealthy were promised elaborate funeral rites and eternal prayers for their souls in exchange for generous bequests to the monastery. The poor, meanwhile, were buried in unmarked graves with minimal ceremony, their souls apparently less worthy of divine attention. The promise of Christian equality before God was revealed as a lie, with salvation itself available only to those who could afford the appropriate fee. The young people who entered these communities seeking spiritual fulfillment found instead a system designed to break their spirits and exploit their labor. Novices were subjected to harsh physical punishments for minor infractions, their wills systematically crushed until they became compliant tools of their superiors. Those who showed talent or intelligence were either corrupted into participation in the system's crimes or driven out entirely. The communities that should have been nurturing the next generation of spiritual leaders were instead producing either cynical collaborators or bitter apostates. The female religious communities faced additional horrors, as their supposed spiritual fathers often viewed them as opportunities for sexual exploitation rather than as equals in the pursuit of holiness. Abbesses, who should have protected their charges, instead delivered them to the lusts of corrupt clergy. Nuns who had dedicated their lives to God found themselves pregnant by men who had taken vows of celibacy, their children either killed at birth or spirited away to unknown fates. The convents that should have been havens of purity became something closer to high-class brothels, their inhabitants trapped by their vows and their lack of alternatives. The very charity that was supposed to be the hallmark of Christian communities became a tool of oppression and control. Monasteries would indeed care for the poor and sick, but always in ways that reinforced the existing social order and their own authority. They taught the poor to be grateful for whatever scraps they received, to accept their lot in life as God's will, and to look forward to rewards in the afterlife rather than seeking justice in this one. The radical message of Christ, with its emphasis on lifting up the downtrodden and challenging the powerful, was carefully edited and sanitized until it supported rather than threatened the status quo. As we contemplate these dark truths about medieval religious life, we must remember that these were not isolated incidents or the actions of a few bad actors. This corruption was institutional, systematic, and deliberate. It represented a fundamental betrayal of everything that religious life was supposed to represent. The men and women who should have been exemplars of virtue and holiness had instead become some of the most corrupt and exploitative members of medieval society. Yet perhaps the most tragic aspect of this corruption was how it affected the genuine faith of ordinary people. The peasants and townspeople, who looked to the church for spiritual guidance and moral leadership, found themselves betrayed by the very institutions they trusted most. Their sincere devotion was exploited, their desperate hope for salvation was commodified, and their trust was repaid with deception and abuse. The corruption of the religious orders represented not just a failure of individual morality, but a systematic destruction of the spiritual foundations upon which medieval society was built. The legacy of this corruption would echo through the centuries, undermining faith in religious institutions and contributing to the great upheavals that would eventually reshape European society. The seeds of the Protestant Reformation were planted in the fields of monastic corruption, watered by the tears of the exploited faithful, and fertilized by the accumulated grievances of generations who had been betrayed by those who claimed to speak for God. And so, as the bells of Compline ring out across the darkened landscape, calling the religious communities to their final prayers of the day, we cannot help but wonder what kind of prayers are really being offered in those candlelit chapels. Are they genuine expressions of faith and devotion, or merely another empty ritual performed by men and women whose hearts have been hardened by greed and whose souls have been corrupted by power? The twisted world of medieval religious orders runs far deeper than most dare to imagine. While we've exposed the corruption that festered within monastery walls, the tentacles of this darkness reached into every corner of society, choking the life from those who sought genuine spiritual refuge. You see, the very foundations of monastic life had become a breeding ground for the most heinous forms of exploitation. Young oblates, children as young as 7 years old, were essentially sold into these institutions by desperate or ambitious families. These innocent souls became playthings for depraved abbots and senior monks who viewed their positions not as sacred trusts, but as licenses for unspeakable cruelty. The corruption was systematic, methodical, and utterly merciless. Monasteries developed elaborate networks for trafficking these children between institutions, ensuring that their crimes remained hidden from the outside world. Documents from the period when they survive hint at the unthinkable. Records speak of special punishments administered behind closed doors, of novices who mysteriously disappeared during the night, and of hushed payments made to families who dared to ask too many questions. But the physical abuse was only the beginning. These religious orders perfected psychological torment into an art form. They would deliberately separate children from any remaining family connections, then systematically break down their sense of self through starvation, sleep deprivation, and constant terror. The goal was to create completely compliant victims who would never dare to speak of what they endured. The monastery scriptorium, supposedly a place of learning and divine contemplation, became a workshop for forging documents that would cover up these crimes. Fake death certificates were crafted for children who had actually been murdered. False records of voluntary donations masked the extortion of grieving families. Even confessional records were altered to protect the guilty and silence the accusers. What makes this even more chilling is how the church hierarchy not only knew about these atrocities, but actively participated in covering them up. Bishops would routinely transfer known predators to new monasteries, giving them fresh hunting grounds. Papal legates carried sealed instructions that essentially granted immunity to certain high-ranking clergy in exchange for political favours and financial contributions to Rome. The economic machinery of this corruption was breathtakingly vast. Monasteries operated as medieval crime syndicates, using their religious authority to launder money, traffic goods, and eliminate rivals. They controlled not just vast tracts of land, but entire trade networks that stretched across Europe. Merchants who refused to pay protection money would find their goods mysteriously spoiled, their ships wrecked, or their warehouses burned to the ground. The orders developed their own secret languages and codes to communicate about their illegal activities. These coded messages, disguised as theological discussions, coordinated everything from the movement of stolen goods to the elimination of witnesses. Archaeological evidence from monastery excavations has revealed hidden chambers filled with torture devices, secret passages for moving victims, and mass graves containing the remains of those who opposed them. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how these religious orders weaponized faith itself. They convinced their victims that suffering was divine will, that resistance was sinful, and that speaking out would damn their souls to eternal torment. This psychological manipulation was so effective that many victims actually defended their abusers, believing that their torment was somehow necessary for salvation. The tentacles of corruption reached into every aspect of medieval life. Monasteries controlled hospitals, turning places of healing into chambers of horror, where the sick and vulnerable were exploited for their remaining wealth before being left to die in agony. They ran schools where education became indoctrination, and where children learned that absolute submission to religious authority was the highest virtue. Even death offered no escape from their depravity. These orders controlled burial grounds and claimed the right to determine who deserved Christian burial. Families were forced to pay enormous sums to ensure their loved ones weren't thrown into unmarked pits with criminals and heretics. The threat of spiritual damnation became a tool for extorting the living and dishonoring the dead. The intellectual corruption was equally devastating. These monasteries, supposedly guardians of knowledge and learning, systematically destroyed texts that challenged their authority or exposed their crimes. Ancient manuscripts containing scientific discoveries, philosophical insights, and historical records were burned by the thousands. They replaced genuine scholarship with propaganda that reinforced their power and justified their cruelty. The medical knowledge they suppressed was particularly tragic. Texts describing surgical techniques, pharmaceutical preparations, and anatomical understanding that could have saved countless lives were deliberately destroyed because they threatened the Church's monopoly on healing. Instead of preserving the wisdom of antiquity, these orders condemned Europe to centuries of medical ignorance and unnecessary suffering. Women's monasteries faced their own unique horrors. Nuns were essentially imprisoned for life, subject to the whims of male religious authorities, who viewed them as property rather than people. Young women who showed any independence or intelligence were broken through systematic abuse, forced labor, and deliberate malnourishment. Many convents became breeding grounds where children born of rape were either murdered at birth or raised as slaves within the monastery walls. The corruption extended to the very sacraments themselves. These orders sold fake relics to desperate pilgrims, claiming that pieces of wood or bone had miraculous healing powers. They charged enormous fees for masses that were never said, for prayers that were never offered, and for intercessions that existed only on forged documents. The sale of indulgences became a massive industry, with monasteries essentially selling tickets to heaven to anyone willing to pay their price. The psychological damage inflicted by these institutions rippled through generations. Survivors who escaped often spent their entire lives traumatized, unable to trust others or form healthy relationships. Many turned to alcohol, violence, or madness as the only ways to cope with memories too horrible to process. The very concept of religious faith became poisoned for countless souls who had witnessed the ultimate betrayal of sacred trust. What's most heartbreaking is how these crimes were committed in the name of God, using the language of love, mercy, and salvation to mask acts of pure evil. The perpetrators convinced themselves and others that their victims somehow deserved their fate, that suffering was spiritually purifying, and that their own actions were justified by divine mandate. The cover-up extended far beyond the monastery walls. Local nobles, dependent on church support for their legitimacy, actively participated in silencing victims and destroying evidence. Royal courts, terrified of excommunication and papal retribution, turned blind eyes to even the most obvious atrocities. The entire medieval power structure became complicit in protecting these criminal enterprises disguised as religious institutions. The economic records that survive paint a picture of staggering wealth built on human misery. Monasteries accumulated vast treasures not through honest labor or divine blessing, but through extortion, theft, and the systematic exploitation of the most vulnerable members of society. They hoarded gold while their surrounding communities starved, built magnificent buildings while children froze in rags, and lived in luxury while preaching the virtues of poverty and self-denial. The ultimate tragedy is how this corruption poisoned the very idea of spiritual seeking for centuries to come. People who genuinely sought connection with the divine found themselves trapped in systems designed to exploit their faith, their vulnerability, and their desperate hope for meaning in a brutal world. The light of authentic spirituality was nearly extinguished by institutions that claimed to represent it, while embodying its complete opposite. This dark legacy cast shadows that stretched far beyond the medieval period, influencing the development of religious institutions, social structures, and human relationships for generations. The scars left by these betrayals of trust created cycles of cynicism, violence, and spiritual emptiness that continue to echo through history. Understanding this darkness isn't about condemning faith itself, but about recognizing how power, when unchecked by genuine accountability, can corrupt even the most sacred institutions. The medieval religious orders serve as a chilling reminder that those who claim to speak for God are often the very ones who have forgotten what genuine holiness actually means. The true measure of their evil lies not just in the specific crimes they committed, but in how they systematically destroyed the possibility of authentic spiritual community for countless souls who deserved so much better. The power of the Catholic Church permeated every aspect of medieval Scottish life, but beneath the gilded vestments and sacred rituals lay a festering corruption that would make even the most hardened soul recoil in disgust. While priests preached of poverty and humility from their pulpits, they gorged themselves on the finest meats and wines, their bellies swollen with gluttony as peasants starved outside the monastery walls. The very men who claimed to speak for God had transformed his house into a den of thieves, where salvation could be purchased like a loaf of bread and sins absolved for the right price. In the shadowy corridors of Scottish abbeys, monks who had sworn vows of chastity kept mistresses and fathered bastard children, their appetites as voracious as their greed. The Abbot of Melrose, a man whose very name should have inspired reverence, was known throughout the borders for his collection of young boys, whom he claimed were merely serving God in special ways. When accusations arose, they were swiftly buried beneath threats of excommunication and eternal damnation. The church had become a predator's paradise, where the most vulnerable souls were delivered directly into the hands of those who would devour them. These holy men dealt in flesh as readily as they dealt in forgiveness. The sale of indulgences became a grotesque marketplace, where the wealthy could purchase their way into heaven, while the poor were condemned to suffer for eternity. Bishop William Sinclair of Dunkeld amassed a fortune that would make kings envious, selling papal pardons like a merchant hawking his wares at market. He built himself a palace that rivaled any noble's castle, complete with gold-encrusted chalices and silk tapestries imported from the Holy Land, all funded by the desperate pennies of those seeking salvation. The monasteries themselves had become little more than elaborate brothels disguised as houses of worship. The prior of St. Andrew's was infamous for hosting elaborate feasts where roasted peacocks and rivers of wine flowed freely, while outside the gates, plague victims rotted in the streets. These supposed men of God had forgotten the very teachings they claimed to uphold, transforming Christ's message of love and compassion into a weapon of oppression and exploitation. Even more disturbing were the ritualistic practices that occurred behind closed doors. The Order of St. John in Scotland was rumoured to engage in ceremonies that bore more resemblance to pagan rites than Christian worship. Initiates spoke in hushed whispers of midnight gatherings where sacred relics were defiled and unholy oaths were sworn in blood. The line between devotion and blasphemy had become so blurred that many questioned whether these men served God or something far more sinister. The Church's treatment of women was particularly vile. Nuns who had dedicated their lives to serving the divine were routinely violated by the very priests who claimed authority over them. The convent of North Berwick became notorious as a place where young women disappeared into the night. Their bodies later found floating in the Forth with strange markings carved into their flesh. When families demanded answers, they were told their daughters had been called to serve God in mysterious ways that mortal minds could not comprehend. Perhaps most shocking of all was the Church's involvement in the slave trade. While publicly condemning the practice, Scottish monasteries secretly purchased and sold human beings like cattle, branding them with holy symbols to mark their ownership. The Cistercian Abbey of Dundrennan maintained vast networks of human trafficking, shipping Scottish peasants to work in their foreign holdings while importing exotic slaves to serve in their Scottish establishments. The irony was lost on no one except the perpetrators themselves. The corruption extended to the very sacraments that form the foundation of Christian faith. Priests would deliberately botch baptisms, ensuring that infants would be condemned to limbo unless their families paid additional fees for proper ceremonies. Marriages were annulled and reformed based on the size of bribes rather than any legitimate theological grounds. Even the last rites were perverted, with dying souls forced to surrender their earthly possessions to secure passage to the afterlife. The papal representatives who visited Scotland were no better than the local clergy they supposedly supervised. Cardinal Beaton lived in such opulent splendour that his household expenses exceeded those of the Scottish crown itself. He maintained a harem of concubines, each more beautiful than the last, while claiming to be wedded only to the Church. His dinner parties were legendary for their excess, featuring entertainment that would have made Roman emperors blush with shame. The monasteries had become centres of learning only in the most twisted sense, as monks studied not theology, but the dark arts of manipulation and control. They perfected techniques of psychological torture disguised as spiritual guidance, breaking the minds of those who dared question their authority. The scriptorium at Iona, once a beacon of knowledge and enlightenment, had been transformed into a factory for forged documents and falsified histories, rewriting the past to serve the present corruption. Even the holy relics that drew pilgrims from across Europe were nothing more than elaborate frauds. The supposed bones of saints were often the remains of criminals and heretics, blessed by corrupt priests and sold to the highest bidders. The Holy Rood of Scotland, claimed to contain a fragment of Christ's cross, was revealed by a courageous monk to be nothing more than common oak wood soaked in pig's blood. When this truth emerged, The monk was found dead in his cell, apparently having taken his own life in a fit of remorse. The tithing system had evolved into a sophisticated extortion racket that would make modern criminals envious. Families were forced to surrender not just their crops and livestock, but their daughters and sons as well. Young men disappeared into monastery walls, never to be seen again, while their families were told they had been chosen for special service to God. The reality was far more sinister, as these youth became slaves in all but name, their labor funding the church's ever-expanding appetite for wealth and power. The confessional, meant to be a sacred space of redemption and forgiveness, had been perverted into an intelligence-gathering operation of unprecedented scope. Priests carefully catalogued the sins and secrets of their parishioners, using this information to blackmail and manipulate entire communities. Adulterous affairs, hidden debts, and family scandals all became weapons in the church's arsenal of control. As we delve deeper into this cesspit of corruption, we must remember that these were not isolated incidents, but systematic patterns of abuse that infected every level of the Scottish church hierarchy. The ecclesiastical hierarchy's stranglehold on medieval society extended far beyond their opulent cathedrals and monasteries. These religious orders had become parasitic institutions, draining the lifeblood from communities they purported to serve. While monks and nuns took vows of poverty, their abbots lived like kings, feasting on delicacies while peasants starved outside their gates. The church's promise of salvation had become a commodity, sold to the highest bidder through indulgences and relics of dubious authenticity. Within the shadowy corridors of these sacred institutions, corruption festered like an infected wound. Abbacies sold positions to wealthy families, ensuring their daughters could live lives of leisure disguised as devotion. Monks abandoned their cells for taverns, their prayers replaced by drunken revelry. The confessional became a marketplace where sins could be absolved for the right price, and where priests gathered intelligence to blackmail the powerful. These holy men and women, who should have been beacons of moral guidance, instead preyed upon the desperate and vulnerable. The monastic libraries, supposedly repositories of divine knowledge, were carefully curated to suppress any ideas that might threaten church authority. Manuscripts containing scientific discoveries or philosophical treatises that questioned orthodox doctrine were hidden away or destroyed entirely. The church controlled not just what people believed, but what they were allowed to know. This intellectual tyranny kept society trapped in ignorance, while the clergy hoarded knowledge like dragons guarding treasure. Perhaps most disturbing was the church's systematic exploitation of children. Orphans brought to monasteries were often used as unpaid labourers, forced to work in dangerous conditions, while being told they should be grateful for the church's charity. Young novices faced brutal physical punishment for the slightest infractions, their spirits broken by those who claimed to serve a loving God. The church preached compassion while practicing cruelty, creating a generation of traumatized souls who would carry these wounds for life. The sacred vows that defined religious life became meaningless gestures, broken as easily as they were made. Celibate priests fathered children with village women, then abandoned them to avoid scandal. Nuns engaged in elaborate schemes to smuggle lovers into their convents, turning houses of prayer into dens of deception. The vow of obedience was perverted into a tool of oppression, silencing victims who dared to speak against their superiors. These weren't isolated incidents, but systemic failures that revealed the rotting foundation beneath the church's gilded exterior. Economic exploitation reached staggering proportions as religious orders accumulated vast estates through manipulation and fraud. They would target dying nobles, pressuring them to donate their lands to secure their soul's salvation. Widows were coerced into surrendering their inheritances, leaving their children destitute while enriching already wealthy monasteries. The church became one of the largest landowners in medieval Europe, not through divine blessing, but through calculated greed and emotional manipulation. The construction of grand cathedrals, supposedly monuments to God's glory, was often financed through the suffering of countless workers. Peasants were forced to contribute labour and materials they could ill afford, watching their own homes crumble while building palaces for bishops. Master builders cut corners to maximise profits, using inferior materials that would lead to deadly collapses. These architectural marvels were built on foundations of exploitation and human misery. The monastic scriptoriums, where manuscripts were copied and illuminated, operated like medieval sweatshops. Scribes worked in poor lighting that damaged their eyesight, hunched over desks that crippled their spines, all while being paid a pittance for their skilled labour. The beautiful books they created were sold for enormous profits, enriching the monasteries while the actual creators lived in poverty. Many scribes developed serious health problems from the toxic inks and pigments they used daily. But their suffering was considered a necessary sacrifice for the church's greater glory. Even the church's charitable works were tainted by ulterior motives. Hospitals run by religious orders often provided substandard care, viewing patients as opportunities for conversion rather than human beings deserving compassion. The sick were subjected to brutal treatments based on religious superstition rather than medical knowledge. Those who questioned these practices or sought alternative treatments were branded as heretics, facing excommunication or worse. The network of pilgrim routes that crisscrossed Europe became highways of exploitation. Monasteries along these paths charged exorbitant fees for basic accommodations, taking advantage of travelers' desperation and devotion. False relics were manufactured and sold at every stop, creating an economy built on fraud and false hope. Pilgrims who couldn't pay were turned away to face bandits and wild animals, their faith offering no protection from human greed. Religious orders also played a sinister role in political machinations, selling their influence to the highest bidder. Abbots and bishops became kingmakers, manipulating succession disputes and territorial conflicts for their own benefit. They leaked confessional secrets to damage enemies and allies alike, weaponizing the sacred trust between priest and penitent. The church's claim to moral authority became a mask for the most amoral behaviors. The education system controlled by religious orders was designed to produce obedient subjects rather than critical thinkers. Students in monastic schools were taught to memorize scripture without understanding, to question nothing and accept everything. Those who showed intellectual curiosity were either crushed into submission or recruited into the church's machinery of control. The brightest minds of the medieval period were either silenced or corrupted by an institution that feared independent thought. Women suffered particularly under the church's oppressive system. Convents that promised sanctuary often became prisons where women were confined against their will. Abbesses wielded absolute power over their charges, subjecting them to psychological torture disguised as spiritual discipline. The church's teachings about female inferiority were used to justify every form of abuse and exploitation, creating a culture where women's suffering was not just accepted, but celebrated as virtuous. The infamous practice of selling indulgences reached its grotesque peak during this period, with church officials literally putting price tags on forgiveness. The wealthy could purchase their way into heaven, while the poor were condemned to eternal damnation, creating a theological economy that made salvation a luxury good. This commercialization of grace revealed the church's true priorities, showing that profit mattered more than the souls they claimed to serve. Perhaps most chilling was the church's systematic destruction of alternative spiritual traditions. Ancient healing practices were branded as witchcraft, their practitioners burned alive. Local festivals and customs that predated Christianity were violently suppressed, erasing centuries of cultural heritage. The church's vision of uniformity required the obliteration of diversity, creating a spiritual wasteland where only approved thoughts could flourish. The judicial system, controlled by religious orders, became a tool of terror rather than justice. Ecclesiastical courts operated in secret, with no appeals process and no protection for the accused. Confessions were extracted through torture, creating a legal system based on fear rather than truth. Those who crossed the church faced not just punishment, but complete destruction. Their names erased from history as if they had never existed. As night falls on our exploration of these dark chapters, we're left with a sobering truth about the institutions we once trusted. The medieval religious orders that promised light brought only darkness, that preached love while practicing hatred, that claimed divine authority while serving only themselves. Their legacy isn't one of spiritual guidance, but of systematic betrayal, a cautionary tale about what happens when power corrupts those who should be its most faithful guardians. The echoes of these corruptions still reverberate through history, reminding us that the greatest evils often wear the masks of the greatest goods. The religious orders of medieval Europe, with their towering Gothic cathedrals and sprawling monastery grounds, presented an outward facade of divine righteousness and spiritual purity. Yet beneath the veneer of holy vows and sacred ceremonies lurked a shadowy underworld of corruption, manipulation, and systematic abuse that would make even the most hardened observers recoil in disgust. While monks and nuns pledged themselves to lives of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the reality within monastery walls told a far different story. These institutions, meant to be beacons of Christian virtue, had devolved into elaborate schemes for accumulating wealth, wielding political power, and exploiting the vulnerable. The very foundations upon which these orders claimed their divine authority were rotting from within, poisoned by greed, lust, and an insatiable hunger for control over the souls and bodies of those they claimed to serve. Consider the systematic financial manipulation that occurred within these supposedly sacred walls. While preaching the virtues of poverty to their congregations, abbots and abbesses lived in palatial quarters adorned with silk tapestries, golden chalices, and sumptuous feasts that would rival any royal court. They extracted crushing tithes from peasant families already struggling to survive, demanding payment in grain, livestock, and labor, while their own granaries overflowed with abundance. When families couldn't pay, the church seized their land, their homes, their very means of survival, all while claiming to act in God's name. The practice of simony ran rampant through these institutions like a plague. Church positions were bought and sold like commodities at market, with wealthy families purchasing abbacies and bishoprics for their younger sons, regardless of spiritual calling or moral fitness. These purchased positions became hereditary in all but name, passed down through generations of corrupt families who viewed the church as nothing more than a business enterprise. Sacred offices that should have been filled by those with genuine devotion were instead occupied by opportunists and predators who saw the cloth as a shield for their darkest impulses. Perhaps most disturbing was the systematic abuse of those who sought shelter and guidance within monastery walls. Young novices, often sent by families who could no longer afford to feed them, became prey for twisted abbots and senior monks who exploited their vulnerability with impunity. These children, some as young as 8 or 9 years old, were subjected to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse under the guise of spiritual discipline. When they dared to speak out, they were punished for bearing false witness against their holy superiors, or worse, accused of seducing their abusers through demonic influence. The corruption extended far beyond individual acts of cruelty to encompass entire networks of exploitation. Monasteries became centers for the production and distribution of forged documents, fake relics, and fraudulent indulgences. They manufactured false miracles to attract pilgrims whose donations would fill their coffers, creating elaborate theatrical productions complete with hidden mechanisms to make statues weep blood or emit mysterious voices. They sold fragments of the true cross in such quantities that, if genuine, Christ's cross would have been the size of a forest. Women's religious orders faced their own unique horrors. Convents became dumping grounds for unwanted daughters, forced into religious life against their will to preserve family inheritance structures. Once inside, these women found themselves trapped in a nightmare of psychological torture, starvation diets imposed as spiritual discipline, and sadistic punishments for the smallest infractions. Mother superiors, drunk on their absolute power over vulnerable women, devised increasingly creative forms of humiliation and abuse, all justified as necessary for the salvation of their charges' souls. The medical practices within these institutions revealed another layer of their systematic cruelty. While claiming to care for the sick and dying, monastic infirmaries became laboratories for primitive and often fatal experiments. Monks with no medical training performed crude surgeries, administered toxic concoctions as holy remedies, and allowed patients to suffer in agony rather than provide effective pain relief, believing that earthly suffering brought them closer to Christ. They deliberately withheld known treatments from those who couldn't pay, watching them die in excruciating pain while their families begged for mercy. These religious orders also served as the intellectual police of medieval society, ruthlessly suppressing knowledge that threatened their authority. They burned libraries, destroyed scientific texts, and executed scholars whose discoveries contradicted church doctrine. The famous Library of Alexandria wasn't destroyed by barbarian invasions alone, but by systematic campaigns led by Christian monks who viewed pagan knowledge as demonic corruption. They hoarded literacy, keeping the common people ignorant and dependent while using their monopoly on learning to maintain their stranglehold on power. The political machinations of these orders revealed their true nature as power-hungry institutions masquerading as spiritual organizations. Abbots commanded private armies, waged wars against neighboring territories, and formed alliances with brutal warlords to expand their temporal authority. They manipulated royal succession disputes, orchestrated assassinations, and fomented civil wars to advance their own interests. The infamous Borgia family's corruption of the papacy represented not an aberration, but the logical culmination of centuries of accumulated institutional rot. Even their charitable works, so often cited as evidence of their virtue, were corrupted by ulterior motives. Orphanages became sources of child labor, and worse, with defenseless children worked to death or sold into slavery. Hospitals served primarily to segregate the diseased from society, rather than to heal, with patients left to rot in squalid conditions while receiving last rites instead of medical care. The poor were fed just enough to keep them alive and dependent, ensuring a steady supply of desperate souls willing to do the church's bidding for a crust of bread. As these medieval religious orders consolidated their power and wealth, they became increasingly bold in their exploitation and abuse. What had begun as genuine attempts at spiritual devotion had transformed into sophisticated criminal enterprises operating under the protection of religious immunity. The very institutions that claimed to offer salvation to humanity had become the primary source of its suffering, turning the promise of divine love into a nightmare of earthly torment from which there seemed no escape. The corruption festering within medieval religious orders extended far beyond the obvious sins of greed and lust. These supposedly sacred institutions had perfected the art of psychological manipulation, turning the very concept of spiritual guidance into a weapon against the vulnerable. Novices entering monasteries were systematically broken down through a process that would be recognized today as sophisticated brainwashing. The initiation rituals were deliberately designed to strip away individual identity and replace it with unquestioning obedience. New monks were subjected to ritualized humiliation, forced to confess imaginary sins, and punished for transgressions they never committed. This psychological warfare continued relentlessly until the novice's sense of self was completely shattered. Only then could the corrupt abbots reshape them into compliant instruments of their will. The monastic practice of silence was weaponized as a tool of control. Monks were forbidden from speaking to one another about their experiences, creating an atmosphere of isolation and paranoia. This enforced silence prevented them from comparing notes about the abuses they witnessed or endured. It also made it impossible for them to organize any form of resistance against their oppressors. Sleep deprivation was another favored tactic. Under the guise of religious devotion, monks were required to attend multiple prayer services throughout the night, ensuring they were perpetually exhausted and mentally vulnerable. This constant fatigue made critical thinking nearly impossible and left them susceptible to whatever twisted interpretations of scripture their superiors chose to impose. Food was used as both reward and punishment in these institutions. Monks who pleased their abbots might receive slightly better rations, while those who showed any sign of independence were subjected to deliberate starvation. This created a system where basic survival depended entirely on the whims of corrupt leaders, fostering an atmosphere of desperate competition among the brothers. The confessional became a tool for gathering compromising information about wealthy patrons and political figures. Abbots would strategically assign certain monks to hear confessions from specific individuals, then use the secrets they learned for blackmail and political manipulation. The sacred seal of confession was routinely violated whenever it served the monastery's financial or political interests. Perhaps most disturbing was the systematic abuse of children who were sent to monasteries as oblates. These young boys, often as young as 7 or 8, were completely at the mercy of monks who had been stripped of normal human compassion through years of psychological conditioning. The abuse they suffered was not merely physical, but spiritual, as their tormentors convinced them that their suffering was somehow pleasing to God. The monasteries also served as convenient dumping grounds for the inconvenient relatives of noble families. Mentally ill family members, political embarrassments, and unwanted heirs were frequently forced into religious life against their will. Once inside, they were subjected to treatments that would be considered torture by any modern standard, all justified as attempts to drive out demons or purify their souls. Female religious houses faced their own unique horrors. Nuns were often subjected to invasive physical examinations under the pretense of ensuring their virginity. These examinations were frequently conducted by male clergy and were nothing more than institutionalized sexual assault. The nuns had no recourse for complaint, as any protest would be dismissed as evidence of their own spiritual corruption. The economic exploitation within these institutions reached staggering levels. Monasteries would deliberately recruit novices from wealthy families, then pressure them to sign over their entire inheritance upon taking their vows. Those who hesitated were subjected to increasingly severe psychological pressure until they complied. Families who attempted to intervene found themselves excommunicated and socially ostracized. The corruption had become so endemic that many monasteries operated more like criminal enterprises than religious institutions. They engaged in forgery, fraud, and extortion on a massive scale. Fake relics were manufactured and sold to gullible pilgrims. False miracles were staged to attract donations. Land was seized through forged documents and intimidation tactics that would have made secular bandits proud. The theological education provided in these institutions was deliberately twisted to serve the interests of the corrupt leadership. Young monks were taught perverted interpretations of scripture that justified every abuse and excess. They were indoctrinated to believe that questioning their superiors was equivalent to questioning God himself. This ensured that the cycle of corruption would continue indefinitely as each new generation of monks was molded into the same pattern of abuse. The monasteries also served as centers for political conspiracy and intrigue. Abbots routinely plotted against secular rulers who threatened their interests. They harbored fugitives, plotted assassinations, and fomented rebellions whenever it suited their purposes. The supposed neutrality of religious institutions was nothing more than a convenient fiction that allowed them to meddle in politics without facing the consequences of their actions. Medical knowledge was deliberately suppressed and distorted within monastic walls. Monks who showed genuine healing abilities were often eliminated or silenced if their success threatened the monastery's monopoly on miraculous cures. Effective treatments were hidden away, while useless or harmful remedies were promoted, ensuring that people remained dependent on the prayers and intercession of the corrupt clergy. The library systems within monasteries became tools of intellectual control rather than preservation. Books that contradicted church doctrine or exposed clerical corruption were systematically destroyed. Knowledge that might empower ordinary people was hidden away or deliberately mistranslated. The monks who served as scribes were often forced to alter texts to support whatever narrative their superiors wanted to promote. Even death brought no escape from the monastery's exploitation. The bodies of deceased monks were often subjected to gruesome post-mortem examinations in search of signs of holiness that could be monetized. Fake stigmata were carved into corpses to create new saints for veneration. The burial practices were designed to extract maximum profit from grieving families rather than provide dignified rest for the departed. The psychological damage inflicted by these institutions extended far beyond their walls. Former monks who managed to escape often suffered from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They struggled to form normal human relationships after years of enforced isolation and abuse. Many turned to alcohol or other destructive behaviors as they tried to cope with the trauma of their experiences. The corruption within medieval religious orders represented one of history's greatest betrayals of trust. These institutions, which were supposed to represent the highest ideals of human spiritual development, instead became factories for producing broken human beings who would perpetuate cycles of abuse and exploitation. The damage they inflicted on medieval society was incalculable, poisoning the very concept of religious authority for generations to come. The legacy of this corruption continues to influence our understanding of institutional power and the dangers of unquestioned authority. The medieval religious orders serve as a stark reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who cloak their crimes in the language of virtue and righteousness. Their example stands as a warning about what happens when institutions designed to serve humanity instead choose to serve only themselves. As we examine this dark chapter of history, we must remember that the true victims were not just the monks and nuns trapped within these corrupt systems, but all of medieval society. The legacy of medieval religious orders, a reckoning of faith and corruption. As the medieval period drew toward its inevitable close, the very institutions that had once stood as beacons of spiritual guidance and moral authority found themselves drowning in the consequences of their own making. The religious orders that had dominated European spiritual life for centuries were now facing a crisis of legitimacy that would forever alter the landscape of Christianity. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the accumulated weight of corruption, abuse, and betrayal had created a powder keg of discontent that was ready to explode. The monasteries and abbeys that had once been revered as sanctuaries of learning and devotion were increasingly viewed with suspicion and contempt by both the educated elite and the common people. The very foundations upon which medieval Christianity had been built were crumbling under the weight of institutional decay. The Great Schism of the late 14th century had already dealt a devastating blow to papal authority. When rival popes claimed legitimacy from different cities, the spectacle of competing religious authorities exposed the political machinations that lay beneath the spiritual veneer. The faithful watched in horror as their supposed spiritual leaders hurled excommunications at one another while engaging in the very worldly pursuits they preached against. This crisis of authority created space for reformist movements that would challenge the established order. The printing press invented in the mid-15th century, became an unexpected weapon against monastic corruption. For the first time in history, critical texts and reformist ideas could be mass-produced and distributed beyond the control of ecclesiastical authorities. Pamphlets exposing monastic scandals circulated freely, while vernacular translations of religious texts allowed ordinary people to access spiritual knowledge that had previously been filtered through corrupt intermediaries. The rise of humanism during the Renaissance brought new intellectual tools to bear against medieval religious institutions. Humanist scholars, armed with improved methods of textual analysis and historical criticism, began to expose the fraudulent nature of many monastic claims. They revealed how documents had been forged, how relics had been manufactured, and how theological doctrines had been twisted to serve institutional interests rather than spiritual truth. Economic changes also played a crucial role in undermining monastic power. The growth of urban commerce and banking created new centers of wealth and influence that existed outside the traditional feudal structure dominated by religious institutions. Merchant families and guilds began to challenge the economic monopolies that monasteries had enjoyed for centuries. The rise of universities, many of them secular institutions, provided alternative centers of learning that competed with monastic schools. The moral corruption that had festered within religious orders for centuries finally reached a tipping point that could no longer be ignored or covered up. Stories of sexual abuse, financial embezzlement, and spiritual manipulation had become so commonplace that they were accepted as normal rather than exceptional. The gap between the ideals that these institutions claimed to represent and the reality of their daily operations had become impossible to bridge. The Black Death of the 14th century had exposed the spiritual bankruptcy of many religious institutions. When faced with genuine crisis, many monasteries had failed to provide the comfort and leadership that people desperately needed. Instead of offering hope and healing, too many religious leaders had either fled their responsibilities or used the crisis as an opportunity for further exploitation. The contrast between their behavior and that of secular authorities, who remained to serve their communities, was stark and damning. Reform movements that had emerged from within the religious orders themselves often found their efforts frustrated by entrenched institutional resistance. Figures like the Franciscan spirituals, who sought to return to the original ideals of poverty and simplicity, were often persecuted by their own orders. The Dominicans who criticized papal corruption faced exile, or worse. These internal conflicts demonstrated that the institutions had become so corrupted that they were incapable of reforming themselves from within. The conciliar movement of the early 15th century represented one of the last attempts to reform the medieval church through traditional means. Church councils sought to address the worst abuses and restore some measure of credibility to religious institutions. However, these efforts were ultimately undermined by the same political and economic interests that had created the problems in the first place. The failure of conciliar reform convinced many that more radical solutions would be necessary. Women, who had often been the primary victims of monastic corruption and abuse, began to find their voices during this period of transition. Female mystics and religious reformers like Catherine of Siena and Birgitta of Sweden used their spiritual authority to criticize institutional corruption directly. Their writings and prophecies, widely circulated and respected, provided powerful testimony against the moral failures of religious institutions. The rise of lay religious movements represented another challenge to monastic authority. Groups like the Brothers and Sisters of the Common Life emphasized personal piety and direct relationship with God, bypassing the institutional mediation that had been the source of so much corruption. These movements demonstrated that spiritual life could flourish outside the traditional monastic framework. Popular culture began to reflect growing skepticism about religious institutions. Literature like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales included devastating portraits of corrupt clergy and religious figures. Folk songs and stories mock the pretensions of monks and abbots. This cultural shift represented a fundamental change in how ordinary people viewed religious authority. The emergence of nation-states with strong royal authority provided an alternative power structure that could challenge ecclesiastical dominance. Kings and princes, who had once deferred to religious leaders, now found themselves in a position to dictate terms to weakened monastic institutions. The seizure of church lands and the subordination of religious authority to secular power became increasingly common. As the medieval period gave way to the early modern era, the stage was set for the religious upheavals that would reshape European Christianity. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century would deliver the final blow to many of the corrupt institutions that had dominated medieval religious life. The Reformers' criticisms of monastic corruption would find a receptive audience precisely because the groundwork had been laid by centuries of institutional failure and abuse. The dissolution of monasteries in Protestant countries represented not just a religious revolution, but also a recognition that these institutions had become so corrupted that they could not be reformed. The wealth that had been accumulated through centuries of exploitation was finally redistributed, though often to secular authorities rather than to the poor, who had been its original intended beneficiaries. Even in Catholic countries that resisted Protestant reform, the Counter-Reformation acknowledged the need for fundamental changes in religious institutions. The Council of Trent imposed new standards of conduct and accountability that represented a tacit admission of previous failures. New religious orders emerged with more stringent rules and better oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the kinds of abuses that had characterized medieval monasticism. The intellectual legacy of medieval religious corruption would influence Enlightenment thinkers who used historical examples of institutional failure to argue for religious tolerance, separation of church and state, and individual conscience. The documented abuses of medieval monasteries became powerful arguments against the concentration of spiritual and temporal power in the same institutions. The social legacy was equally profound. The breakdown of trust in religious authority that characterized the late medieval period contributed to a broader skepticism about traditional hierarchies and institutions. This skepticism would eventually fuel democratic movements and calls for social reform that extended far beyond religious matters. The psychological impact on European society was lasting. Generations of people who had suffered under corrupt religious institutions developed a deep suspicion of claims to moral authority based solely on institutional position. This cultural shift toward individual judgment and personal responsibility would become one of the defining characteristics of modern Western civilization. The economic consequences of monastic corruption also had long-term effects. The misallocation of resources that had characterized medieval religious institutions contributed to economic stagnation and inequality. When these resources were finally freed from corrupt monastic control, they could be redirected toward more productive uses, contributing to the economic dynamism of the early modern period. The educational impact was transformative. As monastic schools lost their monopoly on learning, new educational institutions emerged that emphasized critical thinking and empirical observation rather than rote memorization of approved texts. This shift in educational philosophy laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution and the modern university system. The political ramifications extended across centuries. The failure of medieval religious institutions to live up to their moral claims provided powerful arguments for limiting the political power of religious authorities. The principle of separation of church and state, which would become fundamental to modern democratic governance, had its roots in the recognition that religious institutions could not be trusted with temporal power. The artistic and cultural legacy was equally significant. The disillusionment with corrupt religious institutions inspired new forms of artistic expression that emphasized individual experience and personal faith rather than institutional authority. This shift would contribute to the flourishing of Renaissance art and literature that celebrated human dignity and individual achievement. As we look back on the dark side of medieval religious orders, we see not just a catalogue of historical abuses, but a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of unchecked power. The institutions that began with noble ideals of service, learning, and spiritual guidance gradually became instruments of exploitation and oppression when they were allowed to operate without accountability or oversight. The medieval religious orders ultimately failed because they lost sight of the fundamental principle that institutions exist to serve people, not the other way around. When they began to prioritize their own power and wealth over their stated mission of spiritual service, they set in motion the forces that would eventually lead to their downfall. The lessons of medieval monastic corruption remain relevant today as we grapple with questions of institutional accountability, transparency, and the proper limits of organizational power. The history of these religious orders reminds us that no institution, however noble its founding principles, is immune to corruption when it operates without effective checks and balances. The transformation of European Christianity that began in the late medieval period was not simply the result of theological disputes or political conflicts. It was fundamentally a response to the moral failure of institutions that had betrayed the trust placed in them by generations of faithful believers. The dark legacy of medieval religious orders serves as a permanent reminder of the price of institutional corruption and the importance of maintaining vigilance against the abuse of power in all its forms. In the end, the medieval religious orders fell victim to their own success. The wealth and power they accumulated through centuries of exploitation created the very conditions that made their corruption inevitable. Their story stands as one of history's most powerful examples of how noble ideals can be perverted by institutional self-interest and how the failure to address systemic problems can ultimately lead to the collapse of even the most seemingly permanent institutions. The reckoning that came for medieval religious orders was both necessary and inevitable. Their corruption had become so pervasive and their abuses so systematic that reform was no longer possible. Only through their dissolution and replacement could the religious life of Europe be renewed and redirected toward its original purposes of spiritual growth, charitable service, and moral guidance. The corruption that festered within medieval religious orders ran far deeper than mere financial greed or political maneuvering. By the late medieval period, these institutions had become breeding grounds for the most heinous forms of exploitation and abuse, their sacred vows nothing more than hollow mockeries of their original purpose. The sexual depravity that permeated monastery and convent walls defied every principle these orders claimed to uphold. Abbots maintained harems of young novices, treating their positions as licenses for predatory behavior. The vow of celibacy became a cruel joke as powerful clerics used their authority to coerce and abuse those under their care. Nuns were routinely violated by their male counterparts, their complaints silenced through threats of excommunication or worse. The children born from these unholy unions were either murdered at birth or sold into slavery. Their very existence a testament to the corruption that had consumed these supposedly holy places. Perhaps most disturbing was the systematic trafficking of human beings that operated under the guise of religious charity. Orphans and foundlings brought to monasteries for care were instead sold to wealthy patrons for unspeakable purposes. Young women seeking refuge in convents found themselves trapped in networks of sexual slavery, their bodies commodified by the very people who had sworn to protect them. The elaborate trade routes that connected monasteries across Europe served not only to transport goods and manuscripts, but also to facilitate this horrific commerce in human flesh. The psychological torture inflicted upon those who dared to question or resist was equally appalling. Religious orders developed sophisticated methods of breaking the human spirit, employing techniques that would make the Spanish Inquisition pale in comparison. Solitary confinement in underground cells, deliberate starvation, and exposure to extreme temperatures were just the beginning. They perfected the art of spiritual manipulation, convincing their victims that their suffering was divinely ordained, that resistance was tantamount to defying God himself. The economic exploitation reached staggering proportions as these orders amassed wealth through the most predatory means imaginable. They deliberately created famines by hoarding grain, then sold it back to starving peasants at exorbitant prices. Funeral rites became extortion schemes, with families forced to pay increasingly outrageous sums to ensure their loved ones received proper burial. The sale of indulgences transformed into an elaborate protection racket, where salvation itself was held hostage for profit. The manufacturing of false miracles became an industry unto itself. Teams of actors, often recruited from the most desperate members of society, would stage elaborate healing ceremonies and supernatural events. These fraudulent spectacles drew pilgrims from across Europe, their donations filling the coffers of corrupt abbots, while their faith was cynically manipulated. The supposed relics that drew these crowds were nothing more than animal bones and worthless trinkets, blessed by men who had long since abandoned any pretense of actual belief. The destruction of knowledge that occurred within these walls was not merely neglect, but active sabotage of human progress. Monks deliberately destroyed classical texts that contradicted church doctrine, burning libraries that contained centuries of accumulated wisdom. They suppressed scientific discoveries that threatened their worldview, torturing and murdering scholars who dared to pursue forbidden knowledge. The very institutions that claimed to preserve learning became the graveyards of human intellectual achievement. The recruitment practices of these orders revealed their true predatory nature. They specifically targeted the most vulnerable members of society, those with no family connections or social protection. Young people were lured with promises of education and spiritual fulfillment, only to find themselves trapped in systems of exploitation from which escape was nearly impossible. The vows they took were obtained through deception and coercion, binding them to lives of misery and abuse. The corruption extended to the very sacraments themselves. Holy Communion became a tool of control, with the withholding of the Eucharist used to punish those who challenged authority. Confession became a means of gathering blackmail material, with the secrets shared in supposed sanctity used to manipulate and control. Marriage ceremonies were corrupted into elaborate farces designed to transfer wealth and property rather than celebrate holy union. The judicial systems operated by these orders made a mockery of divine justice. Trials were predetermined affairs where the accused had no hope of vindication. Evidence was fabricated, witnesses coerced or bribed, and punishments designed not to correct but to terrorize. The dungeons beneath monasteries became chambers of horror, where torture was elevated to an art form, justified by the twisted logic that physical suffering could purify the soul. The medical practices within these institutions revealed a callous disregard for human life that bordered on the demonic. Rather than healing the sick, monastery infirmaries became laboratories for human experimentation. Patients were subjected to horrific procedures without their consent, their suffering justified as necessary for the advancement of medical knowledge. The elderly and infirm were routinely murdered when they became too much of a burden, their deaths attributed to natural causes while their possessions were absorbed into the monastery's holdings. The environmental destruction perpetrated by these orders was equally devastating. They clear-cut entire forests without regard for sustainability, poisoned rivers with the waste from their industrial operations, and strip-mined the land for precious metals. Their short-term greed destroyed ecosystems that had taken millennia to develop, leaving wastelands where once fertile valleys had flourished. The political machinations of these orders corrupted entire kingdoms. They played royal houses against each other, fomenting wars that would increase their own power and wealth. They assassinated rulers who threatened their interests, using poison and other subtle methods that left no trace of their involvement. Their networks of spies and informants penetrated every level of society, making them more powerful than kings and emperors. The psychological damage inflicted upon ordinary believers was incalculable. People who had turned to religion for comfort and guidance found themselves manipulated by charlatans who cared nothing for their spiritual welfare. The faithful were driven to bankruptcy through endless demands for donations, their children stolen to serve in monasteries, their lives destroyed by false accusations of heresy. The educational systems operated by these orders were designed not to enlighten, but to indoctrinate and control. Students were taught only what served the interests of their masters, while critical thinking was actively suppressed. Those who showed promise were either corrupted into joining the system or eliminated as threats. The universities that grew from these monastic schools became factories for producing obedient servants rather than independent thinkers. As the medieval period drew to a close, the weight of these accumulated sins finally began to tell. The Protestant Reformation, while ostensibly about theological differences, was fundamentally a reaction to the unbearable corruption that had consumed the religious establishment. The violence that erupted across Europe was not merely about doctrine, but about the rage of people who had finally awakened to the extent of their betrayal. The legacy of this corruption extends far beyond the medieval period. The patterns of abuse, exploitation, and manipulation perfected by these religious orders became templates for future institutions of power. The techniques of psychological control, the methods of financial extraction, and the systems of sexual predation they developed would be adopted and refined by successive generations of those who sought to dominate their fellow human beings. The true tragedy is not merely what these corrupt orders did, but what they prevented from happening. The human potential they destroyed, the knowledge they suppressed, the lives they ruined represent incalculable losses to human civilization. We can only imagine what heights humanity might have reached had these institutions remained true to their founding principles, instead of becoming engines of exploitation and abuse. The dark side of medieval religious orders serves as the eternal warning about the corrupting influence of unchecked power, even when wielded in the name of the divine. Their story reminds us that the greatest evil often wears the mask of righteousness, and that vigilance against corruption must be constant if humanity is to avoid repeating the horrors of the past.